Hi, this is Marco Pimentel. Welcome to the podcast Someone Like You. In this first season, you'll discover founders, creators, entrepreneurs, and business owners who are passionate about creating business models with lasting, sustainable climate solutions.
Having a sustainable product or service as part of your core business is just going to be table stakes for being a business by 2030, 2035. If you don't have sustainability at your core, I just don't think that you will be a very successful business.
Climate action. In order to avoid worst-case scenarios, we need climate action now. The UN's climate panel warns that the world may need to remove billions of tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere each year in the coming decades, which makes it somewhat essential. And this is on top of rapid emission cuts to prevent or pull the planet back from increasingly dangerous warming levels. But accessing the carbon removal market can be complicated, complex, and difficult to understand. How do you build carbon removal into actionable movements within businesses? And that brings me to this week's episode. Joining me is Lucy Hargreaves, Head of Public Affairs and Policy at Patch, a platform that wants to build climate action into everything. Patch powers climate action with a mission to reach gigaton scale carbon sequestration. With its application programming interface, or API, and marketplace, Patch enables people and businesses to seamlessly purchase as little as a gram to gigatons of carbon removal from reputable and trusted carbon removal projects. Lucy is a seasoned leader, strategist, and operator with 20 plus years of global experience focused on climate action and sustainability in rapidly growing startups, politics, the OECD, and private foundations. Here is our conversation.
Thanks for having me, Marco. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, to have a Canadian tech company, or actually, I guess that's not really true. Is it a Canadian tech company?
We are San Francisco based, so US tech company with Canadian co-founders.
Canadian co-founders. Okay, so I figured there was a little bit of a story there. So you have an incredible career history, and one that often when we speak to people, they don't have a lot of backgrounds in sustainability, and you do. So you've worked in Bangkok, you've worked for the government of Canada, government of Ontario around policy and sustainability and environmentalism. So why Patch, and what got you intrigued about the company and want to take on the role of head of public affairs and policy?
Yeah, great question. So, I've spent sort of 20 years plus working on climate and sustainability and environmental issues from a number of different angles, as you mentioned a little bit there in your introduction. And I was kind of the person back in the late 90s who was doing my undergraduate degree focused on environment and resource management. So at a time when these issues were sort of considered to be a little bit more fringe and not mainstream. So I've been in the space for a long time, and I've always tried to position myself in organizations and in places where I feel like I can kind of really drive momentum in the sustainability field. So in my early part of my career, ended up in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, working for the United Nations at a time when the global conversation was around Millennium Development Goals, and that sort of led into the conversation and movement around Sustainable Development Goals. And then did a lot of different things in between there, but wound up in Ottawa about 12 years ago and got drawn into the political world. So worked in politics for the federal government for 5 years, supporting our Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Catherine McKenna, as her director of operations, and then was chief of staff to another minister. And after 5 years in politics, it was just like an amazing opportunity to be, have a seat at the table and to work on some of our climate goals and climate policies. So that an incredible opportunity, but was really looking for a change and looking for a way to roll up my sleeves and be part of an organization or a company that was actually building and delivering the solutions that we need today. And so that was sort of the appeal of Patch to me, was that it is It is a carbon removal platform, essentially, that is helping businesses automate climate action with just a few lines of code. So we're really bringing carbon removal into the hands of companies who are looking to take climate action and neutralize their emissions. So having that kind of like the direct impact and direct engagement with both the supply side and the demand side in the carbon markets was a big draw.
Yeah. And so I just love to chat a little bit about what's, Patches. I guess you consider it a startup. It's a tool, an API that, like you said, it's a marketplace that applies this supply and demand side when it comes to the carbon removal space. So what was Patches' original, what's Patches' mission and how does it work?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, our core mission is to enable gigaton scale carbon removal. And the reason we're focused on that is because when you look at the climate math that guides us to a pathway for achieving net zero by 2050, we need both rapid, deep emission cuts as quickly as possible and as much as possible. But those pathways also show us that we need at least 10 billion tons of carbon removal a year by 2050. And to reach that scale, we need to invest now and we need to really drive capital into those projects that are removing carbon and scaling and commercializing the technologies to remove carbon. So, our mission really comes from that understanding that we need to achieve gigaton scale carbon removal to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Um, so what we do, in fact, is I would sort of call Patch a little bit of the connective tissue in the carbon removal marketplace. So we are a platform. We work with both the supply and demand side of the carbon markets. And what that looks like on the supply side is on our platform, we have over sort of 50 suppliers who list high quality carbon credits, everything from sort of your more traditional nature-based solutions to so those would include things like afforestation, reforestation, to some of the more sort of human engineered or technical solutions or that I think have got a lot of buzz and there's a lot of excitement around them, like direct air capture, biochar, concrete mineralization. So we work with suppliers across that spectrum to help them, like through providing them with the tools and expertise and customer connections, we help them navigate what it looks like to actually sell carbon credits. They're busy doing the day-to-day work of managing their companies. So we really help provide them with the tools to list their carbon credits and get those to market. And on the demand side, we work with demand customers in sort of two main ways. Number one, it's really looking at corporations that have set some kind of net zero target. They're doing the heavy lifting of reducing emissions in their scope one, scope two, and sometimes scope three emissions. And they know that there's a portion of their emissions that are hard to abate that they're going to have to purchase carbon credits for in order to reach their net zero target. So we work with them to put together portfolios of carbon credits that either meet a particular price point that they're looking at or investing in a particular geographic area or in a particular technology type. And so that is we call those kind of like bulk carbon credit purchases. So we facilitate that. But more interestingly, and this is to the API point that you mentioned earlier, we are an API first platform. And so through our API, we are able to enable a whole bunch of other use cases for companies to offer carbon neutral products and services to their end customers. So examples of this would include working with e-commerce platforms to enable customers on those platforms to neutralize their shipping on checkout through a sort of a one-click kind of mechanism. We've worked with financial institutions to make financial products like credit cards. and exchange traded funds, carbon neutral. And really the opportunities using that API are endless. But what the API enables us to do is to link to that robust network of suppliers that we have on the back end.
Yeah, and so in terms of carbon removals and talking about that, I think it was the IPCC report recently that came out in April that I think now has said carbon removal is now has to be part of our plan. As in, I don't, they don't
Right.
believe there's probably a way to get to these type of 2050 goals without having that. So when it comes to both the supply and the demand side, when the supply side, are you finding that there is an overabundance of supply, or is there an underabundance currently of supply?
Yeah, great question. So it's a very supply constrained market right now. So there is an underabundance of supply for sure, which is why we need to inject a lot of capital into those projects. And it's why we need to send strong demand signals, quite frankly, to project developers to encourage them to develop and commercialize their projects. But it is very supply constrained, and it's interesting because you also see it influences sort of the demand side behavior and buying behavior as well. So we see interesting um, sort of financial facilities and uh, sort of interest in unique buying models because of this supply constrained market. We all know that prices are going up for carbon credits in the voluntary markets, and we know that demand is increasing as well. So we're seeing a trend on the buy side for buyers to want to lock in today's prices for future delivery of carbon credits. So we are seeing a trend towards purchases of future vintages and unique financial models like long-term offtake agreements to lock in future delivery of supply at today's prices.
Yeah. And so from a pricing standpoint, obviously there's nature-based solutions, there's your highly technical solutions. What do
Yeah,
you see on average I know there's a widely swing from, if I hear kind of $7 to $1,000 per ton. What do
yeah,
you see in terms of that kind of range, or what's the average that people are paying per
yeah.
ton?
Yeah. I mean, so we see that range, everything from kind of 10, 11, $12 a ton for um, like a typical sort of reforestation type of project, all the way up to eight, 900, $1,000 plus per ton for direct air capture and some of those more nascent technologies. There's no real average, but I think what we're able to do on Patch is because we take this portfolio approach to those bulk purchases that some corporations are looking for, we are able to smooth the price point down and blend together different technology types to get to a price point. There's actually, I mean, there is demand for those higher price point credits, but I wouldn't be surprising you to say that people have sticker shock, right? When they find out how much some of those credits cost. So there's still an appetite to support those technology types, but sometimes the budget just isn't there for making a purchase 100% that consists of a direct air capture or a concrete mineralization project.
Yeah, and I don't know if you share your numbers when it comes to how much carbon tonnage is purchased on patch via either API or through your bulk purchases, but where right now would you say the
Mhm.
bulk of your demand comes from? Is it through the bulk purchases, or is it being through API? Are you able to share anything around that?
Yeah, I mean, there's not too much that I can share around that. I would say it's pretty evenly split right now between those two streams. I can tell you that within the last 12 months or so, that we've enabled removal of over 300,000 tons of carbon. And I mean, that is increasing quarter over quarter quite rapidly. Um, But in terms of the like actual buying behavior on those two streams, the API side and then the bulk purchases, it's pretty evenly split at the moment.
And I think it's probably worth going back to just understanding a lot of the communication around carbon offsets, carbon removals, carbon credits. There's
Yeah.
a lot of chat about it. There's, you bring up carbon offsets, and people, there's a lot of negative connotation towards it too. Can you just give from your perspective and Patch perspectives, just a little bit around, what is carbon removal versus carbon offsetting versus carbon credits, and how does this
Mhm.
just in general, how does this marketplace work?
Yeah. Well, I think the language really matters. And I think the language is actually shifting significantly in the space in terms of how we talk about carbon credits and offsetting. Previously, I would say up until about a year ago or 18 months ago, it was really common for people to talk about carbon offsets as a noun and something that existed as a thing. The language is shifting now, and I think a lot of people, myself included, and I've been really driving this conversation at Patch internally as well, is that we now talk about and conceive of carbon credits as the thing. And offsetting is a verb. So we are seeing from the corporate side buying behavior. So the interest is in buying a carbon credit, which represents 1 ton of carbon removed. And corporations are buying for multiple different reasons. Some are buying because they want to compensate for some emissions that they wish to offset internally. So these are the corporations that have made net zero targets and are looking to purchase a set amount of carbon credits in order to offset their internal emissions to reach their net zero target. But interestingly, and this is actually a trend that is picking up steam from what I'm observing and the conversations that I'm having in the space, we're also seeing corporates buy carbon credits for contribution purposes. So these are corporations that understand the climate math that I was speaking about earlier to get us to 2050, that we need to scale our global capacity for carbon removal to 10 billion tons a year by 2050. They understand that, and they understand that where we're at right now is a micro fraction of that. I think global capacity is approximately, I want to say, sort of, maybe don't quote me on this, but it's on your podcast now, but it's around sort of 50,000 or 100,000 tons per year. So we've got a long way to go. And I would say some more progressive corporations understand that, and they are purchasing carbon credits to make a contribution to that overall global effort to scale the carbon removal markets and help us achieve our global net zero targets. So I like to say, so I actually don't talk about carbon offsets anymore. I talk about carbon credits and offsetting as sort of one thing that you can do with carbon credits. But yeah, the contribution piece is there, and there's a lot of interest in that, and a lot more buying behavior related to that than there used to be. So I would expect that to be a trend that only increases over time.
Yeah, and I think it's the simple idea of carbon offsetting being negative is the fact if you pollute 1 ton and you offset the other, it's still there.
Right,
You're not taking it out,
right.
depending on the project and what you're doing. So when the type of companies that are using Patch being a startup, being a technology company, is it mostly tech companies that are doing this? And just to be clear too, this is all voluntary. These companies are doing this to do it as part of their corporate initiatives. Is that correct? It's all a voluntary market?
Yeah, so we are 100% focused on the voluntary markets right now. So everything that happens on our platform is voluntary. So all of the corporations who are buying on our platform are doing this on a voluntary basis. Um, there's a lot of activity in the compliance markets. We're not in that space at the moment. That's not to say we might not be in the future, but as our company we're just over 2 years old now. We've sort of made a strategic decision at first to focus on the voluntary carbon markets. In terms of who they are, you asked, are these all tech companies? They're really not. There are some for sure, but we see a lot of interest from financial institutions, so a lot of the big banks. There's interest from major airlines as well. Not so much your heavy emitters, because they typically, in most jurisdictions, fall under some kind of compliance regime. So in Canada, your heavy oil and gas emitters or major resource extraction companies would be regulated under the federal carbon pricing system or a provincial equivalent. So we don't see a ton of demand from them. And in the US, this is the same. In California, they're all regulated under the California emissions trading system. But a ton of demand from tech, financial institutions, retail companies, both online retail, but also kind of your more traditional brick and mortar retail, transportation companies like airlines and shipping companies. So it really runs the gamut, but it's definitely much broader than sort of Silicon Valley based tech companies that are buying.
Every week on Someone Like You, we dive into stimulating conversations with founders, entrepreneurs, business owners, and the likes who are consciously and successfully creating sustainable business solutions for the long haul. Tune in every week for a new inspiring conversation on leading climate solutions. And if you're enjoying the podcast, don't forget, please subscribe on the platform of your choice and give us a rating and a review. And so when you talk about voluntary versus the regulated market, when you talk about oil and gas being regulated, can you maybe just discuss just the differences between the two? Maybe is there differences between, obviously there's a whole whack of probably compliance on the regulatory market, but pricing, the type of projects, is there any similarities to any of it? And maybe just to understand the two differences would be helpful.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's do a 101 on compliance markets and voluntary carbon markets. I'll try not to get too in the weeds on this, but at a basic level, compliance markets are, they don't exist in all jurisdictions, first of all. So in the countries or states or provinces that have compliance markets, they can take a couple of different forms. Number one, you could have a carbon price in a jurisdiction, which sort of puts a set dollar amount on carbon and sort of influences and like for regulated industries, influences their practices and the amount of emissions that they can actually emit. In other jurisdictions, the other sort of main compliance tool is a cap and trade market. So this is what exists in California and in Europe through the EU ETS, which is the emissions trading system, and California is the California ETS. And in those kinds of systems, there is a group of industries that are regulated and fall within the system, and they are given a cap on the amount of emissions that they are able to emit on an annual basis. And that cap could vary depending on the particular industry. And if they are able to reduce their emissions below that cap, then they themselves can generate sort of credits that they can trade with other companies that are regulated in that system, who may have not been able to reduce their emissions. So there's some trading that happens there. The voluntary markets exist in a completely unregulated way across the globe. And really, the demand is driven by corporations who have made voluntary commitments and have an interest in purchasing credits to help them meet a particular target they have set. So the most popular one that we've all heard about is the net zero target. And on the supply side, carbon credits are generated by suppliers because they see demand signals in those voluntary markets. And those credits that suppliers are generating are typically, although not always, third-party verified or accredited according to some kind of established protocols for the particular project type. We're actually seeing movement in the space now for some of the more frontier technology type projects that there actually aren't protocols in place to enable accreditation of those projects. So there are a growing number of projects that are not verified or accredited, and that doesn't mean that they're necessarily of poor quality, but that the protocols themselves just haven't kind of kept up with the evolution of technology. There is some intersection between voluntary and compliance markets in some jurisdictions. So California, as an example, does enable the suppliers of certain types of credits to sell into the compliance market. So the suppliers themselves are not regulated, but if they are able to generate credits according to certain protocols and standards that the state government sets, then they are able to sell those credits into the compliance market, and regulated emitters can buy those credits and count them towards their targets. And as you can imagine, there's lots of sort of fine print around that, and a lot of additional sort of guidelines. I think it's about. I think companies within that system are not able to purchase more than 5% of credits from the voluntary system to offset their emissions. And there's so many different kinds of compliance systems around the world and so many different jurisdictions. Each one has their own sort of peculiarities in how they run their system. But there is some overlap in many jurisdictions between the voluntary and compliance markets.
Yeah, and do you think that those will into the future continue to just potentially converge even closer in terms of voluntary and regulated markets?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say for sure, but that's my current take on that, is that seeing what I see on both sides and hearing what I hear from elected officials and policymakers, I do think that there's going to be more of a convergence there for sure. And I think probably a march towards greater standardization of the protocols for different technology types. I think a lot of people, both within the voluntary system and the compliance systems, are really looking for a more standardized understanding of what makes a certain technology type or a certain project type a good project type, and really looking for ways to just be more efficient with how we think about that. Right now, there's just so many different protocols that exist around the world. Some, by kind of third-party nonprofit organizations. Some are government protocols, and it's a very confusing landscape. And I think if we want to just be more efficient generally in the carbon markets, a convergence and a march towards greater standardization would be a positive thing.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to get into the business side of Patch, as in, the business and the branding. It's a 2-year-old startup. How has Patch
Yeah.
to date been funded? Obviously, it has a big ambition, big goal, facilitating this voluntary market, both from a technology and a platform perspective. So maybe just start with, funding. How has Patch been funded to date? Has it been through venture, through grants, through bootstrapping? How
Yeah.
has that started?
Yeah, for sure. So we've raised over 60 million US to date. We are venture funded. So our core investors include A16Z, Co2, Energize, Version 1 Ventures, which is based out of British Columbia. So a number of different venture capital companies came together in the early days and put some really important support behind us. We have not taken any grants that I know of, although something may have happened before I joined the company that I'm not aware of. But it's primarily venture backed. There was a bit of bootstrapping in the early days from our co-founders as they were kind of working through the ideation of what Patch could be. Our co-founders have very strong technical backgrounds, including working at Sonder, Shopify, and so sort of cut their teeth there and wanted to really just focus on how to build a company that is taking robust climate action and how can they be part of that solution. So there was a lot of bootstrapping in the early days, but I think really right place and right time for this company. There's so much happening in the carbon markets and so much opportunity to be that connective tissue between supply and demand. That it was, yeah, I think right place, right time, and a great concept and a couple of great co-founders. So was very attractive from a venture perspective.
Yeah, and one of the co-founders and CEO, Brendan Spelsey, so he had an interview where he said that Patch looks like an API company on the outside, but that it's more of a carbon removal and storytelling company at its core. So I just love to kind of just understand that a little bit more, if you can just kind of expand on kind of what that reference was.
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, I sort of started talking about it a little bit earlier, but maybe I could dive in a bit more. But we, on the supply side of our network, we have very in-depth relationships with our suppliers. These are relationships that we've built over time, and we spend a lot of time with them, really vetting the projects, getting to know the founders of those companies, and really understanding sort of what they're building and what their pain points are. Um, and it really is fundamentally our job to tell those stories to our customers so they can really understand what it is that they're buying, and then clearly and confidently sort of communicate the impacts that their investments are having on climate action. So I think the storytelling piece of what you heard in that interview with Brendan was really about that, is about sort of translating um, what these project developers, I mean, we sort of flip between the language of project developers and suppliers, but what these project developers are really doing, and the real tangible climate action that's coming out of those projects. I think it's, sometimes hard if you're a company to understand what a direct air capture project looks like, or a mangrove restoration project in Thailand looks like, or a concrete mineralization project in Canada. Like these things are, when you're just kind of reading about them on your computer or through an email or looking at them on a platform, it's sometimes hard to really appreciate the real climate contribution or climate action contribution that they're making. So a lot of our work is about surfacing that information that makes a project more tangible and understandable to buyers, and helping equip them with visuals and language and more human related stories that they can tell their end customers or shareholders.
It's confusing, and I think, and that's the thing, right? Like a lot of these projects are hard to understand what they are, and I spend a lot of time doing research, and they still end up being difficult to understand, and often. So understand what you're doing on the storytelling side, and being able to do that. And what's really neat with what Patch has done too, and I think you gave the example of an e-commerce removing carbon from shipping process, is that to the consumer
Yeah.
though, it's so simple. There's education for them to be able to understand what it is, but the process to use patch in that type of application is really incredibly seamless and makes it very easy to understand how to use it. So it's I find that quite easy. So when we think about Patch It to the Future, 2 years old, has a lot of runway in terms of what it's doing and what it's trying to do. Massive ambitions as well. What can we look out for kind of in the future? What's the big plans for Patch if we think a little bit
Yeah.
further? And I know it's hard to do that with a startup and everything, but what
Hard to do that, yeah.
yeah.
Well, I mean, look, we've got a lot going on. Like, just to give you a sense of the last 6 months. So I joined Patch I guess it was about 7 months ago now. And we were about 15 or 16 people when I joined, and we're now over 50. So we are on, a rapid scaling trajectory, which I mean doesn't surprise you for a company of our stage. It's pretty typical, but we're growing fast, and the carbon markets are growing fast as well. So we are keeping pace with that pace. We're expanding our operations in Europe, so that is in addition to our focus in North America. We are doing a lot in Europe. We have a team based out of London. And so really plugging into, both the supply and corporate demand side there. There's a lot going on, and Europe has an extremely progressive, sort of supportive and enabling policy environment. So that really does impact corporate appetite for this kind of thing. We've been launching new partnerships with project developers. I think you probably saw our partnership that we announced recently with Pull to Refresh, which sinks seaweed to remove carbon. So always on the lookout for new partnerships with project developers, and our supply team has many calls every week exploring these new opportunities. So look for more there. And we're also really focused on transparency. So we just launched patch certificates to raise the bar in transparency. And they basically are kind of our certificates 2.0. So through these, we're offering a really high level of visibility on the life cycle of a credit purchase. There's a lot of information that is surfaced on a certificate to enable our purchasers to sort of track the status of their credits from purchase to retirement and have something tangible to showcase and help tell their story of their climate contribution. And then on the policy side, I've been spending a lot of time actually in the last couple of months with elected officials and senior decision makers, both in the US and Canada, talking to them about the importance of scaling carbon removal markets, sending strong demand signals, and really just doing a bit of an education roadshow with policymakers who are grappling with how their governments should participate and what they should do. So on the policy side, I see a lot more of that in my future in particular, just continuing those conversations as governments in North America and Europe really think about how can they support scaling carbon removal. Other than that, I mean, we're just heads down, focused on building. There's a lot going on. There's going to be a lot of big events this year, including New York Climate Week in September, which we'll be part of, and of course COP27 in Egypt in November. So we'll have a big presence there. So just really excited with all of the momentum.
Yeah. And do you feel when it comes to just investment side of things, I actually just watched a really great TED talk by Yuval, what's his last name? He was the one that wrote the book Sapiens, so quite a popular book. And
oh yeah,
basically broke out
on his last name.
He was basically saying we need 2% of investment. That's all we need from like getting away from catastrophic climate issues, and broke down what 2% means and how small that number actually is. And then I read recently that Canada fell short about 60 billion in, I think it was 2021, on climate investments as well. But you get to see
Mhm.
both the supply and the demand side. So how, obviously working with policy too. So do you feel pretty optimistic about the demand that's out there and the momentum that's picking up, that we will, we'll start to get to these type of numbers that we need to be, and start to be pouring the money into investment into climate?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I will be honest, I sometimes go back and forth on this. I'm optimistic, but I've seen a lot in my time, and this is not a new conversation, right? But I think that there has been I think if you had asked me that question 4 or 5 years ago, I would have had a more pessimistic answer. But there has been a real shift, and I can see it, and it's not just a shift in what people are saying, but like an actual shift in behavior. And I think that started sort of around 2019, like late 2019 is when I first started seeing that. Um, and now it feels like the conversation is not like should we do something or not, but it is about how should we do something. And I think there's so much momentum behind regulations and policy that corporations can see coming their way that even if they were not inclined to do something, um, just because they get it and they understand that we need to take robust climate action to limit the impacts of global warming, they can see these sticks coming their way. And I think I mentioned earlier, I mean, Europe is sort of light years ahead from North America generally on a lot of policy fronts, but particularly on sustainability. And climate risk disclosure, as an example, has been something that they've been talking about for a long time. The UK requires it for many types of companies. Various different European jurisdictions require it as well. It's sort of climate risk disclosure has been mandatory in New Zealand for about a year now. And the SEC is now looking at this, and released proposed guidelines back in late March, early April. And so if you're a corporation sitting in the US now, like you can see these things coming. It's that momentum, in my view, is not going to change. So I think that is really driving a lot. So optimistically, yes, I think that climate action will continue. I think there's so much. So there's the stick side that's happening, but I think there's just a lot of public pressure as well. There's a lot of shareholder pressure, and I think that most businesses. So my personal view on this is that having a sustainable product or service as part of your core business is just going to be table stakes for being a business by 2030, 2035. If you don't have sustainability at your core, I just don't think that you will be a very successful business. And I think that's because of the regulatory sticks, but it's also because of the public pressure and the demand from consumers now that they want to, especially younger generations, want to interact with businesses that have sustainability at their core. So I am optimistic. I see corporate climate action continuing. I see it continuing in a positive trajectory. And I think governments get that too. But I think it really takes continued public pressure on both sides for both corporations and governments. I think it's so important that the public, whether it's voting or in an election or voting with your wallet when you're deciding which businesses to use and interact with, I think that really matters, and individuals shouldn't underestimate the power that they have there.
Yeah. Well, I think that kind of gets me to my last question, as we're kind of running out of time. On the personal side of things, I often reference the book The Lorax, and it's this, if you don't know it, it's a book just about our overuse of our resources. And at the end, there's a simple child that gets a seed, and that seed can change the outcome. And it's a great little story. I love it to read to my kids about it. But what can people do from an individual or a business side? What's your thought when it comes to climate and what we're faced with today?
Yeah, I mean, just take a step. I think my core message on this really is every step counts. Every little thing that you do as an individual counts. And everything that a corporation does counts. So just, sometimes people can feel overwhelmed. Corporations can feel overwhelmed. They don't know where to start. It can feel like such a massive task, and it's easy to go into that sort of black hole of doom and gloom, thinking that what you do won't make a difference. But I just encourage, whether you're an individual or a company, just to, make a plan, look at what's reasonable for you, and just start. Just take that first step, whether that's, buying carbon credits, or whether that is as an individual deciding to engage with more sustainable businesses, et cetera. It's just take that first step and just get started.
Yeah. Well said. And I wanted to just thank you for diving deep into what the carbon credit market is, and how it works, and how Patch has grown from a 2-year company to almost over 50 people. And I love to hear that the demand is there, and hopefully the supply starts to catch up as well, and that we can continue. And like you said, it's great to see companies that have big goals, because we do need these big visionary type of projects and companies with what's in front of us. So best of luck with everything that you've done, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. Thanks so much for having me on the show, Marco. Really appreciate it.
This podcast is co-produced with The Brand is Female. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode of Someone Like You. And if you did, please share this. We're a new podcast, and I would love it if you could share it with a family member, friend, colleague, work colleague. Share it on Slack, whoever you do. Just share and spread the message of these incredible brands. Please also support these type of companies. They're doing the hard thing, and the hard thing often takes a lot of people to get on board. And don't forget, please subscribe on the platform of your choice and give us a rating and review. I'm Marco Pimentel. Thank you for joining us today. For more information on Someone Like You, you can find us on Instagram at Someone Like You Podcast, with all the links to the podcast, our website, and more information about the brands that we feature. Thank you again.